Laurie mentioned my first book, Systematic Cover of It, Who Owns England, published in 2019. And I got interested in land from the perspective of an environmentalist, environmental campaigner, and principally was sort of interested in things like, why was it flooding so much, and how is our use of land affecting affecting climate change and affecting our resilience to climate change, or a lack of resilience to climate change. And then I started realizing that you have to kind of engage with landowners, and you need to know who owns land. And I started to realize how difficult it was to even discover who owns land in England today. And I think that's the first thing I really wanted to touch on is the secrecy around land ownership, the enduring secrecy that has been around this subject. Because of course, who owns land has for many hundreds, indeed maybe arguably for 1,000 years in England, been closely bound up with power, and with wealth. And our countryside is of course full of physical barriers to us seeing what goes on in some of the very large estates that dominate large swathes of the countryside. Signs like this one here, private keep out signs, trespassers will be prosecuted signs, and we'll come back to some of the legislation, the laws around that later. But also I think the secrecy goes deeper. It goes into the very institutions that we have as well, the way in which the data, the information about land ownership remains also behind paywalls and behind closed doors. So, theoretically, you ought to be able to look up who owns land in England and also in Wales via the government's land registry. And it has been around, after all, for about 160 years. But it still hasn't actually finished registering all the land in England and Wales. And there's about 15% of land in England and Wales that hasn't been registered yet. That doesn't mean that it's not owned by anyone. It just means that the land often won't have changed hands on the open market in that time, and so has never come to be registered. And for the remaining land that is registered, there are about 24 million land titles registered with the land registry, and you have to pay £3 to view each and every one of them. So, add that up, something like £72 million in order to access all of that information. And of course, if you just want to find out who owns a field down there, or a building over there, that's not such a big expenditure. But to actually try and get a grasp of the whole system, the whole picture, and to start to see how concentrated land ownership is, it would cost you, to go via the official route, would cost you a very large amount of money. Now, obviously, when I started investigating that, I didn't have £72 million to spare. And I can assure you that even after selling a few copies of the book, I still do not have that sum of money to hand. So I tried to find other routes to try and get a handle on this question of who owns England. And so I used various tools that we have at our disposal as citizens, tools that I think we should all be using regularly, things like the Freedom of Information Act to put in requests to public bodies, also to water companies that are bound by a kind of sister act to that, environmental information regulations, looking at data that's been published up until now on farm subsidies, which can start to give you a sense of land ownership in an area as well. And also looking at something that's called Highways Act maps. I'm not going to go into full detail of the nerdy detail of them now, but you can read more about them in my book, and we can talk about them later if you're interested. But basically trying to find proxy methods to get a sense of land ownership. And to cut a long story short, what I ended up finding was that land ownership is highly unequal in England, and in fact less than 1% of the population own around half of all England by my best estimates. And to give you a sense of what that level of concentration of ownership, that inequality of ownership, can look like on the ground, I thought, well, firstly, let me just show you this graph graphic that tries to break that down a little bit more, where we can see that, despite being told by many politicians over the years that we live in a property owning democracy where everyone can, has a fair chance to get there, get onto the housing ladder, homeowners' land comprises about 5% of England. That's everyone who owns a home and a garden is about 5% of the country in total area. And of course, many millions of people can't afford to even to buy a house and a garden. And but then compare that to actually what is owned by corporations, about 18% of the country. And my estimate is that about 30% of the country remains in the hands of the landed aristocracy and gentry, many of whom have passed on that land and inherited that land for centuries. Some of them with families that go back all the way to the Norman Conquest in 1066. So this is a very long-standing issue that we have, but it's also one that's highly relevant to today, and I'll come to that in a sec. But I wanted to also show you something closer to home here, a part of the country, and to show you what concentrated land ownership looks like on Dartmoor. So just 15 landowners own half of Dartmoor National Park. We sort of might think that national parks are owned by the nation, and of course in many countries they are. In the United States they're owned by the federal government. The land is simply owned by the government. That's not the case in Britain. The majority of land, in fact the vast majority of land in all of our national parks is owned privately by a variety of individuals and companies and organisations. And on Dartmoor, as many of you I'm sure know, the largest landowner by far is the Duchy of Cornwall, this large purple swathe here in the centre, the ancient forest of Dartmoor. And then some of the surrounding lands, which are also commons, are owned by a variety of organisations like the National Trust and South West Water, but also some very old estates like the Mastow Estate and other ones that have been assembled more recently. So even within a part of our country where there are many, of course, there are access, lots of good aspects of Dartmoor around access, and I'll turn to more of that in a bit. But it's actually, in terms of ownership and management of the land, it is all a lot of it is still privately owned and subject to the whims of those landowners, essentially. So why does land ownership matter today? Well, one of the reasons I would say it matters today, and it's not just simply a question of historical interest, is that land is essential to the fight against the climate and nature crises that we face. Now, obviously, we need to be doing everything we can to slash our emissions, to get off fossil fuels, to bring down the carbon emissions that we're putting into the air. But we also know that we put too much carbon up in the air already. And one of the ways, the safest and most surest way to take the carbon out in the atmosphere is by maximising, optimising our carbon sinks, our natural carbon sinks. And many of those have been damaged over the centuries as well. Our forests have been cut down, our peat bogs, which is what is shown here on this map, have been damaged, burned, and drained, and are now acting as a net carbon source rather than the net carbon sink that they should be. So this map just shows you where the majority, where our most carbon rich soils are in the country, and the darker the shade of red, the more carbon. So we can see here that it's concentrated in areas of our uplands, the kind of upland peat bogs, the North Pennines and Cumbria and Kielder around there, also in Wales, of course, in the uplands of Wales, some also in the Fenlands and Somerset Levels, and of course also on Dartmoor. So there's a large number of peat bogs on Dartmoor, which are very important carbon stores. In fact, the carbon stored in our peat soils in the UK contain about 3 billion tonnes of carbon, which is 3 times more than our woodlands. So we think of trees as being obviously essential to fight against climate change, and they are, but our peat arguably is even more important. Now, this brings us to a question of who actually owns this carbon, who owns the land in which this carbon is locked up. And I've looked into this, and it turns out that only around 150 landowners own the vast bulk of our soil carbon. They own, there's 150 grouse-moor estates that dominate the uplands of England. Now, that's not in Dartmoor. Dartmoor doesn't have red grouse. It doesn't have grouse estates. We have pheasant shoots. We have some hunting of deer that goes on here. But in the vast swathe of those upland peat areas up the spine of the North Pennines, Peak District and so on, that land is really dominated by some very, very large upland estates, almost all of which are driven grass shoots. And that means that they manage the land very, very intensively. This is what they do to it. They essentially set fire to it. Our largest carbon store annually set on fire by the landowners, which, to be honest, is pretty outrageous and is something that really needs to be brought to an end. And the government has said it is bringing it to an end, but it hasn't. It's tried various voluntary schemes. It's it's put in place some fairly weak laws full of loopholes, which still enable landowners, grass moor owners, to burn the heather on the peat and dry out the peat in the process. And it's still going on to this day. So, we think about places like the Amazon and Indonesia and the amount of carbon that's going up into the atmosphere when, former President Bolsonaro enabled, settlers and large agribusinesses to set fire to the Amazon. We're essentially doing the same to our own carbon sinks in this country, and it's some of the biggest and wealthiest landowners in the country who are allowed to do it. So we really need to be doing something about that. That's a major priority, I think, for a future Labour government, because unfortunately, I don't think this one is going to do anything about it. Now, another very important habitat that we have in Britain is temperate rainforest, and that is the subject of my more recent book that Laurie mentioned earlier, The Lost Rainforests of Britain. This pictured here is one of Britain's temperate rainforests. It's Blacktor Copse on Dartmoor, so in your backyard. It's the cousin to the more famous Wistman's Wood, but they're both temperate rainforests. They are, as you can see from this photo, absolutely teeming with life, with what's called epiphytes, the plants that grow on other plants, the mosses, the lichens, the ferns that thrive in the wet climate that makes this part of the country suitable for temperate rainforest. And some people still say to me, well, how is it possible that we have rainforest in this country? They're just woods, surely. They're just nice wet woodlands. And of course they are just nice wet woodlands, but they're also part of this much broader global ecosystem that extends around other parts of the globe where there are temperate rainforests in places like the Pacific Northwest of Canada, in places like New Zealand and Tasmania, and in the Atlantic fringes of Britain and Ireland. And I think the fact that we've kind of forgotten this fact, that we aren't really aware, many of us, of the existence of these wonderful ecosystems, is, I think, a bit of a tragedy, really. And I think it's bound up with our with the country's kind of disconnection from nature. And to be fair, I did not realise that we had quite so many amazing places like this until I moved to Devon a few years ago and started exploring them more. And I walked across Dartmoor before, taken part in 10 tours when I was a teenager, but never really appreciated what amazing ecosystems we do have here. Now, unfortunately, whilst we do have them still, they are very much smaller in size than they would once have been. Before I say a bit more about that, though, before I go into the doom and gloom, let me just show you a few more pictures of some of the epiphytes we get growing in these temperate rainforests. So this is one of my favourites, tree lungwort, or Lobaria pulmonaria, to give it its scientific name. You might find it in places along the edge of Dartmoor. I've found some before in around Holne, around Buckland in the Moor. Grows very slowly and is very picky about where it grows. So you tend to find it only really in ancient woodlands or growing on ancient trees. And two other examples here. This first one you'll see quite a lot more of up on the moor, string of sausages lichen, which grows on hawthorns and rowans across the moor. You can see it sort of festoons entire trees in some cases. And my favourite of all is hazel gloves fungus, which somebody once described it to me as looking like Donald Trump's tiny orange hands, which, they've got a point, but I think it also is slightly more charismatic than that and more attractive than that. So if I've actually been finding quite a lot of this recently, looking in old uncopiced hazelwoods around the edges of Dartmoor and Bodmin Moor. So if we want to talk more about that, I'm happy to geek out to my heart's content about that. And it's something I think we should, it's good to get more people involved in, you know, amateur botany, amateur naturalism. I'm very much an amateur naturalist, but really, really excited by the idea that you can actually find examples of these species and add to our, you know, the sum total of our knowledge, because a lot of them haven't been very well studied, and they certainly haven't all been recorded. So, however, as I said, there are very, very few of our temperate rainforests left today. Unfortunately, we're a rainforest nation that managed to cut down most of our rainforests over the centuries. And so whilst there is a temperate rainforest zone in Britain, you know, the climatic conditions that allow for rainforests to thrive over around 20% of the country, as shown in this first map here. The second map next to it shows you what we think are the remaining fragments, covering considerably less than 1% of the country. So, you know, we really need more landowners and farmers to help protect and restore them. And on Dartmoor, as we saw earlier from the map of land ownership, a large chunk of it is, of course, owned by the Duchy of Cornwall, and it's the Duchy who own Wistman's Wood and Blacktor Copse, those two surviving fragments of temperate rainforest on the High Moor. So, you know, they're absolutely tiny remnants of what used to exist across parts of Dartmoor. And, you know, I've been engaging with the Duchy of Cornwall over the last 18 months or so, talking to them about the possibilities of allowing these two amazing fragments to expand. And I think there is interest there, but it's definitely something where we need to encourage Prince William to get involved, and I think encourage other landowners to do the same. And that's, you know, that's bound up obviously with the discussions that are going on about the future of farm payments. Obviously, I think, you know, farmers particularly should be rewarded for bringing back nature on land, but, you know, also large landowners I think also need to be encouraged and held to account if they're not doing so as well. So I've talked about land and secrecy, I've talked about land and inequality, talked about land and the ecological crisis, and just to lastly touch upon another reason why I think land and who owns it matters nowadays is because it affects the public's access to nature. And here's a recent protest that I was on with other local residents from Totnes and surrounding area. Did this protest on a large estate on Dartmoor, and we were doing so because the landowner, whose name is Alexander Darwell, who owns this very large 4,000-acre Blatchford estate on the southern edge of Dartmoor, recently took Dartmoor National Park Authority to court with a claim that there is no legal right to wild camp on Dartmoor. Now, you know, as someone who, as I say, has wild camped on Dartmoor many times, including half my life ago when I did 10 tours, I was pretty outraged to hear that this landowner thought that they could do this. And there have been, as hopefully you will have seen, a number of protests, ongoing coverage of this issue. The court case was held at the end of last year, and we haven't yet heard the outcome, but we understand that the decision is going to be imminent and may well be made by the end of this week. And I am not feeling too good about it. I suspect that the landowner may win, and if we do, that could well be the end of wild camping on Dartmoor, which is the only place in England and Wales where it's legal to wild camp. People, of course, go wild camping surreptitiously elsewhere, you know, but I do think there's something extremely precious about having, you know, being able to go up onto the moor and know that you're not going to be turfed out by an irate landowner in the morning, and to be able to have that right to go and, you know, see the stars. So, you know, it's something which I really hope that there will be a big outcry if the decision does come and it is against us. I think there needs to be a huge outcry about that, because, you know, we have a right to roam in England, and I'm very grateful that we do. And it's thanks to the last Labour government that we do, because of the Countryside and Rights of Way Act that was passed in 2000. But it is still a partial act. It is only a partial act. It's unfinished business in my view. It's, you know, something that covers only 8% of England, those, you know, upland areas that we talked about earlier, including, of course, Dartmoor and some of those other mountains and moorlands. But so much of England remains effectively off limits to the public. And I think that really relates to our disconnection from nature and to why more of us perhaps don't, aren't rioting in the streets about the condition of nature, the collapsing biodiversity, and it's the vital importance of land to help fight the climate crisis as well. So I would love to see, and I'm part of a campaign calling for an extension to the right to roam to more places in England, such as to our woodlands and to our rivers. And essentially, that brings me to my last slide, which is really to briefly put forward 5 suggestions for what I hope will be a future Labour government and a possible agenda for land reform in England. And it'd be great to get your thoughts on these suggestions. Firstly, I think we need to end the absurd secrecy around land ownership that means we don't know who owns the country that we live in, and by opening up the land registry and making it publicly accessible, just like Companies House has been for many years. You can find out who owns and runs and owns shares in companies for free, and I don't see really ultimately why you shouldn't be able to do so with the land registry as well. Secondly, I think that we need to have a community right to buy in England, like they do in Scotland, and it was really encouraging to hear last year that Lisa Nandy has announced that Labour would support the extension of community right to buy laws modelled on what Scotland currently has and has had for the last 20 years, and to see them extended into England. And I think that would be hugely important and progressive, meaning that community groups could, when land comes up for sale, or local pub or property, village hall or whatever, that if those areas had been previously designated as assets of community value, having importance to the community, that the community group would then have first dibs and sufficient time to raise the funds to be able to buy them. And I think that whilst there are some much weaker laws in England around a community's right to bid for land currently, often that just simply can't happen and doesn't result in the community being able to end up owning the asset, because they're quickly outbid, the market process proceeds, someone else with ready cash, huge amounts of cash to hand, will come in and gives them the community. So I really think it would be a fantastic step forward if there was stronger laws around community right to buy in England, and I think it would also start to see a greater equalisation of land ownership as well as a result of that. Thirdly, so Labour has an excellent policy currently around investing, borrowing to invest essentially £28 billion a year in capital investment to help combat the climate crisis. And I think there's a very good case to put some of that investment into land and nature projects. As we saw earlier, we need to restore some of our biggest carbon stores to stop them from actually emitting carbon, as many of our peat bogs now are, and start drawing down carbon instead. So I would hope that Labour would put some of that, a proportion of that investment fund towards either buying land outright, or towards helping repair and maintain some of those natural carbon sinks. And in order to do so, I think that should be coupled with a really strong land use strategy. I think land is, in some ways, it's a sector that has essentially is very unregulated still. There's not very much that not many policy levers that can be pulled in order to ensure that land is actually helping towards solving things like the climate crisis. So a land use strategy, I think, could help guide decisions about a better use and more sensible use of land in the future. And there have been discussions about this. There is a land use framework that DEFRA are currently working on, but my suspicion is that it will be very, very weak and will probably end up sitting on a shelf or end up being rejected, just as the government rejected last year's National Food Strategy. So I think it will again fall to a future Labour government in order to put one in place. And lastly, I'd love to see the right to roam extended in England to woodlands, greenbelt land, and of course to secure long into the future people's right to wild camp, perhaps not just on Dartmoor, but also in other national parks as well. So I think I'll leave it there and see what you guys think.